There is a letter folded so many times it has worn through at the creases, and it was carried in the boot of a Texas rancher named Amos Kerr for the better part of a year. And the strange thing about that letter is that the man who carried it could not read a single word of it. The first line, the part a schoolteacher read aloud to him in the year 1871, goes like this: "Dear Mr. Kerr, you do not know me, but I have been writing your advertisement out in my own hand every night for a week, trying to find the courage to answer it." Amos Kerr had placed an advertisement for a wife because his ranch was failing for want of a second pair of hands and a reason to keep going, and he had received an answer from a woman named Della Fenn, and he had carried her every letter folded in his boot because it was the closest he could keep them to his heart, and because a letter in a boot is a letter no ranch hand can find and read aloud and laugh at. Amos Kerr had never learned his letters. He was ashamed of it the way a proud man is ashamed of the one thing he cannot do, and he had built his whole correspondence with Della Fenn on a secret that he knew, the moment she arrived, would have to come out. This is the story of a man who fell in love with words he could not read, and the woman who wrote them, and what happened when the secret in his boot finally had to be spoken aloud. A letter worn through at the creases is a letter that has been opened and refolded 1,000 times, and most letters that worn have been read 1,000 times, which is what makes this one strange, because the creases on Amos Kerr's letter came not from reading, but from carrying. He took it out at night and held it, and ran his thumb over the writing he could not decode, the way a man holds a thing he loves and cannot fully reach, and he folded it back into his boot every morning, and across a year of that the paper wore soft as cloth at every fold, a letter loved nearly to pieces by a man who could not read a word of it. Amos Kerr was 40 years old and had worked since he was 8, and there had never been a year in those 32 with a school in it. He could rope and brand and read weather and read cattle and read men, all the readings that kept a man alive on the Texas range, but he could not read a page, and in 40 years he had built his life carefully around the gap so that no one would know. He had a hand named Coley who could read, a young man Amos trusted, and when Della's first letter came, Amos had taken it out to the far pasture where no one would see, and had Coley read it to him, swearing the boy to a secrecy that Coley, to his lasting credit, kept. Coley read him every letter and wrote down every reply that Amos dictated, and the two of them conducted, across a year, the courtship of a man too proud to admit he needed a boy to do his reading. Della's letters undid something in Amos that 32 years of work had packed down hard. She wrote like she was talking, plain and warm, and she asked him things no one had asked him, and she told him things a woman tells a man she has decided to trust. She had been a widow in Arkansas, no children, a hard few years behind her. She wrote that she was not looking for a handsome man or a rich one, only a steady one, a man who would be where he said he would be. Amos had Coley read that line back to him 3 times, out in the far pasture, and then he sat on his horse a long while and did not say anything, and Coley, who was young but not stupid, did not ask why. The shame of it had shaped his whole life in ways no one saw. He had turned down a place on the Cattlemen's Council because there were papers to read. He had let a crooked buyer cheat him once rather than admit he could not read the bill of sale, and had eaten the loss and the silence both. 40 years of small surrenders, each one to keep the secret, each one costing him a little more than the last, until the not reading had become less a gap in his learning than a wall around his life, and Amos Kerr had lived behind it so long he had stopped believing there was any other way to live. Coley the hand never breathed a word, not to the other men, not in town, not once, and Amos paid him for the reading without either of them ever naming what the pay was for. Out in the far pasture, with the cattle for an audience, a 40-year-old man and a boy of 19 conducted a courtship by proxy, the boy's young voice giving shape to a widow's words, and then taking down a hard man's halting replies, and something in the strangeness of it bound the two of them. Coley would say years later that those afternoons in the far pasture were the first time he understood that a grown man could be brave and ashamed at the same time, and that the two were not opposites at all. The trouble with a courtship built on a secret is that the secret has a date of reckoning, and Amos Kerr's reckoning came with a date and a train. Della Fenn was coming to Texas to marry him. She had written it plainly, the day and the railhead, and asked only that he be there to meet her, and Amos had Coley write back that he would be, and then Amos had lain awake for 3 weeks, understanding that the woman who had fallen in love with his letters was about to meet a man who could not read hers. He thought about keeping the secret. He thought about it hard. He could go on having Coley read to him in the far pasture for the rest of his life, a married man sneaking off to have a hired boy read his own wife's words. He knew, even thinking it, that it was no kind of marriage, that a thing built on a year of letters could not survive being built on a lie underneath the letters too. But the shame was old and deep, and a proud man does not lay down his shame easily. And Amos rode to the railhead on the appointed day, with the secret still in his boot, and no plan for what to do with it. He had Coley's last reading of her in his head as the train came in. Della had written, in the final letter, "I am not afraid of a hard life, Mr. Kerr. I am only afraid of a man who is not what his letters say. Be what your letters say, and I will cross any distance to you." Amos stood on the platform with that line going around in him like a wheel, because his letters said he was a man who could write them, and he was not, and he did not know how to be what his letters said when the letters themselves were the lie. He practiced, those 3 weeks, what he might say. He would walk the fence line at dusk and say it to the wire. He tried versions where he kept the secret, and versions where he told it, and the keeping always sounded, even to his own ear, like the beginning of a marriage rotting from the foundation up. He had built a year of trust with this woman on words that were his, and a method that was a lie. And he knew, walking the fence in the dark, that Della Fenn deserved to choose the real man, and not the one the letters had let her imagine, even if the choosing went against him. What he could not get past was the fear of her face changing. He had built her, in his mind, out of a year of warm, plain letters, and he had built, too, the way she might look at him once she knew, the pity, or the disappointment, or the quiet recalculation of a woman who has traveled a long way for less than she was promised. A man can stand a great deal. Amos Kerr had stood 40 years of small surrenders. What he was not sure he could stand was watching the warmth go out of the one person who had written to him like he was worth writing to. Della Fenn stepped off the train, and she was not what he had pictured, and was somehow exactly right. A plain, steady-eyed woman who looked at the Texas heat, and the rough railhead, and the big weathered man waiting for her, and did not flinch at any of it. She came toward him and she said his name as a question, Mr. Kerr, and Amos Kerr made the decision a coward makes 100 times, and a brave man makes once. "Before you say anything else," he said, "I have to tell you a thing, and you may want to get back on that train when I do, and I will pay your fare home and not blame you." He took the worn letter out of his boot, her first one, soft as cloth from a year of carrying. "I have carried this next to me for a year," he said. "It is the most precious thing I own, and I cannot read you one word of it. I never learned. Every letter you sent, a boy read to me in the far pasture, and every letter you got, I said out loud, and the boy wrote down. The words were mine, Della Fenn. Every one was mine, true as I know how to be, but the reading and the writing were borrowed, and I have been too proud and too ashamed to tell you, and I will not start a marriage with that lie sitting under it." He stood there, a big proud man holding a worn-out letter, having laid down the one shame he had spent 40 years hiding, in front of a stranger, on a railroad platform, in the Texas heat. And he waited for her to get back on the train. Della Fenn did not get back on the train. She looked at the worn letter in his big hand, and at the man holding it, and at the thing he had just done, which she understood better than he knew, because laying down a deep shame in front of a stranger is a kind of courage that no amount of reading and writing can teach. "You carried my letter in your boot for a year," she said. You rode to a far pasture, so a boy could read you my words where no one would see you needing it. And the first thing you say to me, before hello, before anything, is the truth that could send me away." She took the worn letter gently out of his hand and looked at it, her own handwriting, soft from his carrying. "Mr. Kerr, I wrote in that last letter that I was only afraid of a man who was not what his letters said. I have just met a man who is more than his letters said." The letters said steady. They did not say brave enough to hand a stranger the truth that costs him most. That part you added just now, standing here. She married him that week. And then Della Fenn, who had been a schoolteacher's daughter before she was an Arkansas widow, did the thing that made the whole town tell the story for years. She taught him. Every evening, after the work, she sat the big, proud 40-year-old man down at the kitchen table, with a child's primer and his own dignity intact, because she did it where no hand could see, the same far pasture mercy he had needed all along, only now it was his wife giving it. It took the better part of a year. The first thing Amos Kerr ever read with his own eyes, slow and stumbling, by lamplight, with Della's hand on his shoulder, was that first letter from his boot, the one that began, "You do not know me, but I have been writing your advertisement out in my own hand every night for a week." There is a thing the educator Horace Mann said, that a house without books is like a room without windows. And Della Kerr believed it, and filled her house with both, and taught her husband to read every one. But she said, late in her life, telling the story to a grandchild, that the truest letter Amos ever sent her was not in any of the ones the boy wrote down. It was the one he spoke himself, with no words on paper at all, on a railroad platform, when he handed her a worn-out page he could not read, and told her the truth that he thought would lose her, and won her instead. She did not answer him right away, and the not answering was the longest few seconds of his life, the train still steaming behind her, the offer of the fare home still hanging in the Texas air between them. Amos Kerr stood and took it, whatever it was going to be, the way he had learned to take weather and loss, square and silent, bracing for her to turn back to the platform and the life she had left. But she was not recalculating. Eleanor of the letters, Della Fenn in the flesh, was doing the opposite of recalculating. She was looking at a man who had just handed her, before hello, the truth most likely to cost him everything, and she was understanding that a year of warm letters had told her less about Amos Kerr's heart than these 10 seconds on a platform had, and that the steadiness she had crossed a country for was standing right in front of her, holding a worn-out page in a big, careful hand, waiting to be sent away and not running from it. He had rehearsed the offer of the fare home a dozen times on the fence line, and it still came out rough, and that roughness was the truest part of it, because a smooth man might have managed the confession as a kind of charm, and Amos had no charm and no smoothness, and offered her only the bare thing itself. "Here is what I am. Here is what I am not. You may go, and I will pay for the going." There was no performance left in him. He had spent it all walking up to the truth, and what stood on the platform was simply a man, emptied of his secret, waiting to learn what he was worth without it.